And then we'll share the screen. And here we go. The author's whole point is to demonstrate Messiah has a better priesthood. Now, let me just get this so it's centered. And let me just come back here. In chapter 14, he was speaking about this whole section is Messiah's superiority to Aaron. And so in verse 14, let's just come back here. He says, I surely bless you and give you many descendants. And so after waiting patiently, we're coming, I'm sorry, in chapter 4, he had said in verse 14, wherefore, since we have a great high priest, so he begins to flow into Messiah being superior to Aaron. And this is what he's been demonstrating is the superiority of Messiah, because he wants them to obey him to leave the city in lieu of its coming destruction. Its destruction being a manifestation of the judgment of God because of Israel's national sin of having rejected Yeshua as Messiah. So he says, he introduces this section all the way through chapter 10 about Messiah's superiority to Aaron. And so he'll say he has a better status, he has better qualifications, and he has a better priesthood. And so that's where we are. And when we went into chapter 5, that was where we had the third warning in danger of spiritual immaturity by not following through in their faith in Yeshua and obeying him as they should. So in this section, the author introduces us, doesn't necessarily introduce us to, but he writes of the comparison between Yeshua and Melchizedek. There's only two passages in the Hebrew scriptures that speak of Melchizedek. Let's just look at them because they're brief. So the first is in Genesis chapter 14. And remember, Abraham rescued Lot from those nations that had invaded Sodom and Gomorrah and taken the people captive. Among them was Lot and his family.
Let's go.
And hold on one second. Let me just come back here for a moment if I can, or because I don't think I muted everyone. I'm getting some noises from the microphones. There we go. I'm sorry. So let me come back, and here we are. So as we said, he's writing on Melchizedek, and in chapter 14, Abraham delivers Lot and others, of course, but the focus, of course, is on Lot. And in verse 18, it says, after Abraham rescued them, and in his return trip from the northern region into modern-day Syria is where Abraham went to rescue Lot. It says, then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He brought out provisions for Abraham. And he was priest of God Most High. And he blessed Abram, saying, blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abram gave him a tenth, it says, of everything. And then the other passage where Melchizedek is mentioned, there's only two, is Genesis 14, as we saw, and then Psalm 110. And in Psalm 110, verse 4, David writes, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. So there's not a whole lot of passages about Melchizedek, not a whole lot said, but on the little revelation that we're given, the writer, the author, is going to draw a number of conclusions and make a number of comparisons with that of Messiah. So the comparisons the writer makes in this context here in chapter 7 is threefold. It's going to make three major statements. And the first thing he does is he makes a comparison between Yeshua and Melchizedek in chapter 7, verses 1 to 3. And then in verses 4 through 10, he makes a comparison between the order of priesthood of which Melchizedek was a part, the order of Melchizedek, and the order of Aaron as these two distinct priesthood orders. And then the third thing he'll do is he'll compare the Levitical priesthood and the priesthood of Yeshua. And that's what chapter 7, and then he brings this all to a conclusion in verses 26 through 28. So we're going to go through, we'll go through, I think, through verse 20 or so here today. So first of all, in verses 1 to 3, this Melchizedek, he's making a comparison between Yeshua and Melchizedek, verses 1 to 3. So he says, this Melchizedek was king of Salem, priest of God Most High. He met Abraham, returning from the defeat of the kings, and blessed him. And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. So let's just hold there for a moment. So the basis of this comparison, or what the writer wants to write about, is what's found in Genesis 14, which we just read. But we may come back to that. So you may want to just have your finger in that passage. When Melchizedek, king of Salem, brings out bread and wine, he is described as the priest of God Most High. And he blessed Abraham, saying, blessed be Abraham by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. Blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies. Then Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. In Genesis 14, verse 18, it says, then Melchizedek, king of Salem. And then it says he was priest of God Most High. So it speaks of these two offices or ministries that Melchizedek held. Now, in his comparison of Yeshua and Melchizedek, he's going to bring out 6 similarities or 6 comparisons between Melchizedek and Messiah. First of all, he points out that they both are kings and priests. This Melchizedek was king of Salem and priest of God Most High. So the first thing he wants to do is to point out how both were king priests. So Melchizedek is referred to as the king of Salem, Genesis 14, verse 18. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem. Now, this word Salem is the ancient name for Jerusalem. Ir is the Hebrew word for city. The city of Salem, and Salem is from the root word in Hebrew shalom, which means peace. And the writer to the Hebrew is going to point this out, as we'll see in a moment. But in Psalm 76, we have reference to Jerusalem by its ancient name. 76, verse 4, I think it's verse 2. Psalm 76, verse 2. Let me get that. 76, verse 2, where it says, in Judah, God is known. His name is great in Israel. His tent is in Salem. His dwelling place in Zion. Of course, he's talking about the temple is in Jerusalem, and it is on Mount Zion. Zion also sometimes being a name for the city of Jerusalem itself. But the temple is on Mount Zion, the city of Zion, and it being Jerusalem, city of peace. And Melchizedek's name, as the writer is going to point out, Melchizedek's name means king of righteousness. And he mentions that in verse 2. First, his name means King of Righteousness. Well, the first part of his name, Melech, M-E-L-E, we transliterated into English, Melech. Sometimes, at our service, when we say the blessing, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Ha'olam, King of Ha'olam, King of eternity, King of the universe, King of all things, Olam, the ages, oftentimes used for the universe or all that is. So Melech is King of Tzedek. It's from the word for righteousness. A tzadi is a righteous one. Tzedek is righteousness. Our tzedakah box in the back of the sanctuary means righteousness. It's oftentimes used for donation, but giving is a way of expressing one's righteousness as one gives generously. So Melchizedek, Tzedek, and Tzedek, Melchizedek, the second phrase, Tzedek, meaning righteousness, was a Jebusite dynastic name. For example, look at Joshua chapter 10. Joshua chapter 10, you remember Joshua was to bring about Israel into the land. And in chapter 10, you'll see, and remember, the city of Jerusalem this was a Jebusite stronghold. And so in chapter 10, now Adonai Tzedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had taken Ai, totally destroyed it, doing to Ai and its king as he had done to Jericho and its king, and that the people of Gibeon had made a treaty of peace. But notice the king's name, Adonai, the Lord of, the master of, the head of, Tzedek. Tzedek is like a dynastic name. It's like David is a dynastic, like a dynasty. It's the family name. So Melchizedek, although Tzedek means righteousness, Melchizedek means he was king, Melech of this dynasty, Tzedek. And Adonai was this king who was named Lord of this dynasty. So that's where the name derives from, but its meaning is that of righteousness. And he's the king of Salem, and he's the priest of God Most High, El Elyon, God of the heights, God of all. So Melchizedek knew the true God, and he was a servant of the true God. He was a mediator of man to God and God to man, of the Jebusites at that time, as a righteous king. And that's not to say the Jebusites were a nation of God, but in that period of time, Melchizedek knew God, and he was a servant of him and mediated God's presence to the people over whom he served. So he was a king and a priest. His name and title reveal two things about his reign. Number one, he ruled in righteousness, which is why he was called Melchizedek. He ruled in righteousness, which is what his name means, and he ruled in peace, which is what Salem means. He was the priest king of righteousness and of Salem. So he must have ruled well, ruled in righteousness, conveying morality and equity and trustworthiness. And he ruled in peace. He brought peace to the city and perhaps the nation. And what's interesting is that these two characteristics, as a comparison, these two characteristics are also true of the future reign of Messiah and of the future reign of Yeshua, who is the Messiah, when he establishes his kingdom. So in Isaiah 9:6, we have this very famous passage about Yeshua's nature and character. So in chapter 9, these titles, these names that are given to Messiah: for to us a child is born, to us a son is given. The government will be upon his shoulders. He will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. So there's the peace aspect. And of the increase of his government and peace, there's again, there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness. So the two things that will particularly characterize Yeshua's kingdom in the Messianic age is that of peace and of righteousness, the very things that characterized Melchizedek's reign as the priest king of Salem. The second thing the writer does is he makes a comparison between what we're looking at. Hold on, let me just come back. Are the 6 similarities. So first of all, there's the similarities between them as kings and priests, as being priest kings. Second similarity is that the Melchizedekian priesthood and Yeshua's priesthood are priesthoods which provide a blessing. So it says in back to Hebrews chapter 7, Melchizedek was king of Salem, priest of God. He met Abram returning from the defeat of the kings and blessed him. And so Melchizedek blessed Abraham. So Melchizedek's priesthood was a priesthood by which he brought blessing to others. And thus this is demonstrated through Melchizedek's blessing of Abraham. And Messiah's blessing, he blessed Abraham with the words of blessing, where he said in chapter, back to chapter 14, trying to go back and forth here. In chapter 14, it says, he blessed Abram by saying, blessed be Abraham by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And then he blessed God. So he prayed a blessing upon, he conveyed the blessing of God upon Abraham as in acknowledging the God Most High as the creator of the heavens and the earth. And so, of course, one of the blessings that Abraham had received by God that's now reiterated by Melchizedek is the blessing of the land. And that seems to be what Melchizedek may be focused on as he prays a blessing of Abraham with the blessing of God on Abraham in calling God the God of the creator of heaven and earth. And in doing so, he's going to create a nation out of Abraham, and he's going to give Abraham a land from the creation, out from the creation that God had made. And thus he calls him the creator of heaven, the heaven and earth. But he blesses Abraham. And Messiah's blessing, as we'll see in a short moment, is the blessings that come by way of the new covenant. He'll expound on that as we get further into the book of Hebrews, but he gives some indication of it in verses 6 and 7 of this chapter. We'll see in a moment. But again, first of all, they're both kings, they're both priest kings, and they both have a priesthood that brings blessing. And then they both gave, or then there's the comparison he makes over the giving and receiving of tithes. So in the case of Melchizedek, he says in verse 2, and Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. It's here that he mentions the meaning of his name. First, his name means king of righteousness. Then also king of Salem means king of peace. So his reign would be characterized, Melchizedek's reign as a king priest was characterized by righteousness and peace. And as we saw in Isaiah 9:6, the anticipation and promise is that Messiah's reign will be will be characterized as being a reign of righteousness and of peace. So in this verse, the author defines the meaning, but the one who receives tithes is superior to one who gives them. And so that's his point. He met Abraham, blessed him, and Abraham gave him a tenth, my translation says, of everything. Now, Melchizedek was superior to Abraham, and that is denoted by the fact that Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek. Yeshua, as a Melchizedekian priest, is superior to any other priest in that tithes will be paid to him, and that will take place in the Messianic kingdom. So, in other words, Melchizedek's priesthood is of a superior nature in that the priests, Aaron and so on, are going to descend from Abraham, and Abraham, their great forefather, was inferior to Melchizedek, and similarly, Aaron's priesthood therefore will be inferior to Yeshua's priesthood, because his priesthood is Melchizedekian and not Levitical. He will ferret this out further as we get into this chapter. A fourth thing he does is makes a comparison between, or shows a comparison of the nature of Melchizedek and Yeshua's priesthood. They were independent high priests as such. And the writer will explain. So you look at verse 3. He says, without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, like the Son of God, he remains, talking about Melchizedek, like the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. So Melchizedekian's priesthood was an individual or independent priesthood. It was not a priesthood based on descendancy. It was not a priesthood based on ancestry. It was a priesthood that stood independent and was individual. The same will be the case with Messiah, since his priesthood is also Melchizedekian, which makes it superior to the Levitical priesthood because it was not dependent upon ancestry. So the text states he was a priest of God Most High. That is in Genesis, as well as here in the book of Hebrews, chapter 7, verse 1, priest of God Most High. Genesis chapter 14, he was priest of God Most High. The focus is that his nature as a priest was independent of any ancestry, and this is why he gives us this phrase. He is without father or mother. It doesn't mean that he didn't have a father or mother. He's speaking about the similarities between him and Yeshua, or I should say, the similarities are making a comparison he's making a comparison between Aaron's priesthood and Melchizedek's priesthood, but in doing that, he's trying to demonstrate Yeshua's priesthood is superior to that of Aaron because it is Melchizedekian and not Levitical. The Levitical priesthood was dependent upon ancestry. You had to be of the tribe of Levi. You had to be of the family of Aaron or one of the priestly families, which then indicated what function you would have, whether you served as high priest, whether you took care of the objects in the holy place and Holy of Holies, whether you took care of the curtains in the case of the tabernacle and the various elements of the temple, the tabernacle depended upon your ancestry. In the case of Melchizedek, his priesthood was not based on ancestry or descendancy, as indicated by the fact that there's no record of his father or mother. Now, in the case of Yeshua, Yeshua has a father and mother. Joseph is his adopted father, and his mother is Miriam or Mary. So when it says that Melchizedek was without father or mother, it doesn't mean he didn't have a father or mother. It just means that there's no record of his immediate family members, father and mother, and he doesn't need a record of his family members for the purpose of his priesthood, because his priesthood is not ancestral, it's not family, it's independent, just as Yeshua's, which makes it superior to Levi's or Aaron's. And in that manner, Yeshua's priesthood is similar because it is not based on any ancestry. Similarly, not only is without father or mother, but this is the point that it focuses on. It's without genealogy. There's no record of his ancestry. Well, why? It's not important to his priesthood. It may be important for other things, but with respect to Melchizedek's or what God wanted us to know about Melchizedek, him being a priest and king, his ancestry was not important for that purpose. And similarly, it's not important for that purpose in Yeshua's life. Now, Yeshua's ancestry with respect to his kingship is critical. He needed to be a son of David. And so we have two genealogies, one in Luke chapter 3 and one in Matthew chapter 1, that outlines his ancestry as that of being from the descendant of David and of the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because to be a king in Israel, you had to be, number one, a Jew, which is why the Matthew's genealogy opens up with Yeshua. The book of the genealogy of Yeshua, the Messiah, the son of David, had to be a son of David to in order to be of the kingly line. The son of Abraham had to be a Jew in order to be the king of Israel. So your kings had to be Jews and they had to be descendants of David. So ancestry for the purpose of reigning as king was essential. But with an ancestry with respect to serving as a priest in Levitical manner of things was essential. But to being a priest in the Melchizedekian order of priesthood, ancestry was not important. It was an independent priesthood. And so therefore, and that makes it superior to Aaron's priesthood, which makes Melchizedek a superior priest, or at least his order of priesthood is superior. And therefore, Yeshua's order of priesthood, being Melchizedekian, makes his priesthood superior to that of Aaron. So he's without father or mother. There's no record of his immediate family, no record of his ancestry. There's no record of his birth, no record of his death. So all of these lack of information emphasizes the independent nature of his priesthood, which makes his priesthood superior. So insofar as the Melchizedekian order of priesthood was concerned, ancestry was not important in establishing one's claim to priesthood. So how did one become a priest after the order of Melchizedek? There had to be a divine appointment. And that's why Psalm 110 is critical. It's a divine appointment. If you look, for example, if we come back to Psalm 110, verse 4, the Lord has sworn. See, it's a divine appointment and will not change his mind. You are a priest after the order of Melchizedek. So his priesthood was that of merely being divinely appointed as a priest. And so now you ask, at what point did God divinely appoint him as priest? And we'll see that in a moment, but it was at the resurrection. So what is the significance of the resurrection? The significance of the resurrection, theologically speaking, is in 2 points. Number one, it demonstrates, theologically now, it demonstrates that God accepted the atonement that Yeshua provided in order that the sins of Israel and of the world can be atoned for. So the resurrection, number one, authenticated the death of Messiah as a viable atonement for the sins of the world. And the resurrection then revealed God's acceptance of Yeshua's blood atonement as an atonement sufficient to bring about the forgiveness of sins and to convey the righteousness of God, or let's use the word impute the righteousness of God to individuals that benefit from the atoning sacrifice of Messiah that gives us, results in eternal life and access to God, and ends our separation or alienation from God. So on the one hand, the resurrection demonstrates that the atonement of Messiah is the atonement, the only atonement that can provide remission for sins. The second thing it did was it demonstrated that Yeshua was now appointed as a priest in the order of Melchizedek for providing that mediation between God and man to God. So the Melchizedekian priesthood is a superior priesthood to that of the Aharonic priesthood for this matter. So Melchizedek's appointment to priesthood was independent of human relations. It was an appointment by God. We don't read of where Melchizedek was so appointed. We're simply told he was a priest of God Most High, and the only way he could have been a priest of God Most High is if God had appointed him as such. And how did he appoint him? What was the mechanism? We don't know. But we do know the mechanism by which Yeshua was so appointed, because the resurrection was his appointment as our great high priest. And that's why he then ascends to the right hand of the Father and makes intercession for us, which the writer will speak of as we get further into chapter 7, the conclusion of chapter 7. Now, this was not true, speaking of the need for family ancestry. Melchizedek's priesthood, and thereby Yeshua's Melchizedekian priesthood, was not dependent upon family ancestry. This was not true of the Aaronic order of priesthood. With regard to Aaron and the Levitical priesthood, there was a need for family ancestry. And this is shown in Numbers chapters 16 and 17, where Aaron and his sons are anointed, consecrated as high priests of Israel. And when we get to Ezra and Nehemiah, we find that in those books, after the return of the Jewish people from Babylon under the Persian administration, that those priests, that those who claimed to be priests but could not authenticate their claim through ancestry, through some lineage, through some documentation that they were of the right family, could not serve as priests despite what their personal claims might be. They had to have ancestral notarization that they were indeed priests by virtue of their ancestral heritage. That was true of the Aaronic order, not true of the Melchizedekian order. And thus, Messiah did not need family ancestry to authenticate his claim. What he needed was divine appointment. And that divine appointment was seen at the resurrection. The fifth comparison that the writer makes between the Melchizedekian and Aaronic priesthood is that the Melchizedekian priesthood was timeless, or we could say eternal. In verse 3, it had an eternal dimension. We can see that at the end of verse 3. Without father, mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, like the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. So the Levitical priesthood had a definite beginning and a definite end. In Leviticus chapters 8 and 9, to serve as a priest, you had to be 25 and you served until you were 50. So there was a definite beginning and definite end with respect to when a legitimate descendant of Levi could serve as priest. So there was a beginning and end with respect to when a priest within the order of the Levitical priesthood could serve. So you served when you were 25, that's when you began to serve, and at 50, your service ended. Not only was there a beginning and end to when a Levitical priest would serve, but there was also a beginning and end to when the Levitical priesthood began and when the Levitical priesthood ended. The Levitical priesthood began with the consecration of Aaron and his sons as priests, Leviticus 8 and 9, and it ended with the inauguration of the new covenant when Messiah said, "This is the blood of the new covenant poured out for the remission of sins." And Paul makes reference to the fact in Romans chapter 10, verse 4, Messiah is the end of the law for righteousness. That is the end of the law so as to enable one to receive the righteousness of God, because the righteousness of God could not be received or conveyed through the Mosaic law. It could only be received and conveyed through the new covenant. And the new covenant would be inaugurated by the Messiah. And thus, when he inaugurated the new covenant, the old covenant, the Mosaic law, would then be brought to its conclusion, its end. So the Levitical priesthood had a definite beginning and a definite end, and the priests within the Levitical priesthood had a definite beginning when they served and a definite end when they served. Not so and here's where it says they served between when they were ages 25 and ended at 50. Not so the Melchizedekian priesthood. The Melchizedekian priesthood is an eternal priesthood. God can anoint, can divinely appoint whomsoever he so desires to serve within that priesthood. He chose Melchizedek to serve, and we're told in the Psalms the only other person that would serve within that Melchizedekian order would be the Messiah of Israel, as Psalm 110 prophesied and the resurrection authenticated. And then the sixth thing, and last thing that he makes the comparison, is the Melchizedekian priesthood was a universal priesthood and not a specific priesthood. What I mean is, look at again verse 3, without father, mother, without genealogy, without beginning or end, like the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. The Levitical priesthood was limited to the nation of Israel. So Aaron was not a priest over Syria. He was not a priest over Babylon. He was a priest over the house of Israel. And so the priesthood of Levi was a national priesthood. It was a priesthood limited to the nation of Israel. The Melchizedekian priesthood is applicable to all peoples. So Melchizedek, let's assume he was Jebusite, his priesthood could be extended to Abraham, who is a Hebrew, and to other nations that he might serve over as God would bring those nations to him. But he blessed Abraham. In blessing Abraham, he's functioning as a priest. And as he functions as a priest, though a Jebusite or whatever nationality or ethnicity he may have been, he was serving as a priest toward Abraham or over Abraham and conveys blessing upon Abraham, even though he's not of the same nationality, ethnicity, race, whatever term we like to use, as Abraham. Similarly, Yeshua is a Jew. As a Jew, he is the king of Israel. As a Melchizedekian priest, he can be a priest forever for all peoples and for all nations. He's not a Levitical priest, which would have limited him only as a priest over Israel. But he's not a priest only over Israel. He may be a priest serving within the confines of Jewish tradition, such as in a temple that he would build, and he may utilize Jewish traditions as a Jew, of course. Messiah is a Jew, but as a Jewish Melchizedekian priest, his priesthood can be applicable and effective for all peoples. If it wasn't that way, then his atonement as our great high priest, our great high Melchizedekian priest, if he was not our great high Melchizedekian priest, his priesthood, his atonement would not be applicable to Gentiles so as to save them. But because his priesthood is Melchizedekian, it's a universal priesthood, and thus, even though his offering is on a Jewish altar in the temple, with offered within a Jewish context at Passover, so as to provide a specific atonement for Israel, it at the same time provides a universal atonement for the nations of the world, because he is a Melchizedekian priest. Very critical that we recognize this, so that our Gentile brothers and sisters can understand can experience the benefit of the atonement, which is offered within a Melchizedekian order of priesthood. Kind of an interesting thing to think about. But then again, the parts all fit together, which makes it so understandable and credible. So Melchizedek was not a pre-incarnate appearance of Messiah, as some suggest. And here are the reasons why. Number one, it says in verse 3, he was like the Son of God. Some translations say being made like the Son of God. The Greek word here for like, my translation, NIV, like the Son of God, is the word aphomoiomenos. Aphomoiomenos. And this word aphomoiomenos means to resemble or to be similar to. So he was made similar. Melchizedek was made similar to what the Son of God would be made like, or he was made similar to that of the Son of God, but he was not the Son of God. So he was not a pre-incarnate appearance of Messiah. And the similarity is not with respect to his essence or being. It's not with respect to who he is as a person. His similarity to Messiah is with respect to what the writer has been writing about, which is the similarity of the priesthood. So their likeness is not with respect to being like him in nature or essence of being, but he is like the Son of God in that their priesthoods are eternal, their priesthoods are universal, etc. So that's where the similarity is. Further, Psalm 110, verse 4, distinguishes Melchizedek from Yeshua. It says, the Lord has sworn will not change his mind, speaking now to Messiah, you are priests forever in the order of Melchizedek. So there's a distinction between you, who are in the order of Melchizedek. So Melchizedek is one, Yeshua is another. And one prerequisite for priesthood was being a human being, which the writer to the Hebrews has stated. In chapter 5, verse 1, it says, for every high priest is selected from among men and is appointed to represent them. So to be a high priest, you had to be a man. And so Yeshua does not become a man, a human man, until his incarnation in Bethlehem when he is born. His pre-incarnate appearances are just that. They're pre-incarnate, they're pre-birth, they're pre-becoming a human being. when Messiah appears in the Hebrew scriptures, he's referred to as the angel of the Lord because he is not a man. He may look like a man, just like if you look at Genesis chapter 18, when the three men appear to Abraham, they are angels. One is the angel of the Lord of the three. You can look at the text and see that more specifically, Genesis 18 and 19. So, but all three are referred to as men, but they're angels. Why? Because when angels appear, they look like men. In the case of Yeshua, when he appears in the Hebrew scriptures, when he's made reference to in the Hebrew scriptures before his incarnation, he's not referred to as a man, but even though he may look like a man, he is referred to as the angel of the Lord. It's not until his birth that he is a man. So Melchizedek can't be a pre-incarnate appearance of Messiah, because for him to be a king and a priest, he must be a man, according to Hebrews chapter 5, verse 1. Certainly that's true of Messiah. Melchizedek is a man that is the king of Salem. He can't be a pre-incarnate appearance because Yeshua has to be a man in order to be a priest, and Melchizedek, or a priest king, and Melchizedek is already a priest king, as stated in Genesis 14. And it can't be a theophany. That means an appearance of God or manifestation, because Melchizedek held the office of a king priest, which was a long-term office, an eternal office, which would only be ended at his death. So he can't be just a temporary theophany, which theophanies are. They appear and they disappear. He had to be an individual in his own right, and not a pre-incarnate appearance of Messiah, as indicated by these indications. So the order of Melchizedek is superior to the order of Aaron. And the first superiority, this is what he now speaks of three of them. He's going to speak, first of all, now we're looking at chapter 7, Hebrews chapter 7. We looked at verses 1 to 3, where there's the comparisons being made. Now he'll draw on those comparisons and show how Melchizedek's order of priesthood is superior to that of Aaron. And the first comparison or contrast, the first statement of superiority, is that Melchizedek receives tithes, and the one that receives tithes is superior to the one that pays them. And that's the point he'll make in chapter 7, verses 4 and 5. So he says in verse 4, just think how great he was, speaking about Melchizedek. Now, my translation says just think, but the Greek says, now understand. He's calling upon the people to reflect on what he's about to write and come to embrace it and fully understand it, so that it would lead to their obeying Messiah, who is in a superior order of priesthood. And if you think Aaron's order of priesthood is significant, Melchizedek's order is superior, and Messiah is in that order of priesthood. Therefore, you should obey him, particularly with respect to his command to leave the city when it's surrounded by armies. So when he says just think, he means now understand this, take this to heart, fully comprehend the significance of what I'm about to write. And he says, fully understand just how great Melchizedek is. This word, how great, pelukas, means how important he is, how significant he is. Even though there's very little written about him, what is written about him is incredibly significant and important as we think of what we know of Melchizedek, as the writer is helping us to understand, in comparison to that of the Messiah of Israel. So he says, consider how important, how significant. First of all, this importance is pointed out by him saying, even the patriarch Abraham gave him a tenth of the plunder. This word plunder, akrothinion, doesn't just mean plunder, it means chief spoils or the finest spoils. So what Abraham gave him a tenth of was the best stuff that he was able to plunder from the kings that had taken Lot and the others captive. So he didn't just give him a tenth of what he had, he gave him a tenth of the best of what he had. And notice also how he makes reference to Abraham. He says, now I want you to understand just how significant Melchizedek is. Even, he doesn't just say even Abraham, he says even the patriarch Abraham gave the finest of the spoils that he had captured or had seized. By him making reference to Abraham, the patriarch, he's not just drawing attention to his understood status. He's using a term that emphasizes his dignity, his reputation, his important status that he has. Consider the patriarch Abraham, not merely consider Abraham. And he's the first of the patriarchs. He's the one that God has called out to establish his nation. So all these statements heighten the importance of Abraham. And Abraham, given how important he is, the chiefest of the patriarchs, the father of the Jewish people, the father of Aaron, and in a sense, the father of the Levitical priesthood, is the one paying tithes to the superior one. Melchizedek is superior to Abraham, and he's paying to Melchizedek the finest of the spoils, which serves to indicate Melchizedek is superior to Abraham in a significant way. So as important as Abraham was, he was inferior to Melchizedek. Verse 5, now the law requires the descendants, so we're back to the sense of ancestry, the law requires the descendants of Levi who become priests to collect a tenth from the people, that is, their brothers, even though their brothers are descended from Abraham. So the Levites who would receive tithes from the people were superior, the superior tribe to the rest of the people. That's the imagery he's saying. The Levitical priesthood was superior to all the other aspects of Israel's existence, because all the people paid tithes to the Levites. The Levites did not pay tithes to themselves. And they were descendants of Abraham. And despite that, and despite them being brothers, they were commanded by the law to pay tithes to them. So the Levites were superior to the rest of Israel, and they're paying tithes to Melchizedek through the ancestry of Abraham, which makes Melchizedek superior to the Levites. So if he's superior to Abraham, he is superior to the Levites. So Melchizedek collected tithes from the patriarchal father, Abraham. And second, he says, the one who blesses is superior to the one who blessed, who is being blessed. And so in verse 6, he says, this man, Melchizedek, however, did not trace his descent from Levi. He doesn't trace his descendancy from anyone because his priesthood is an independent priesthood. It's one that's divinely appointed. So this man, however, did not trace his descent from Levi, yet he collects a tenth from Abraham, and he blessed him, the one who had the promises. So Melchizedek's not a descendant of Levi, yet he collected tithes from Abraham, the great grandfather of Levi. Remember, Levi is the son of Jacob. Jacob is the son of Isaac. Isaac is the son of Abraham. So he's the great grandfather. Abraham is the great grandfather of Levi, or Levi is the great grandson of Abraham. And in that, Levi is seminally in Abraham, he is in effect paying tithes to Melchizedek, which makes Melchizedek superior to Abraham and his great-grandson Levi and all of his descendants as such. So he gave blessings to Abraham. That is, Abraham, who was given promises of God. You would think Abraham was superior because he has the promises of God. Not so. Melchizedek is superior because he gives the blessings to the one who had the promises. And so though Abraham was blessed with the promises of God, Melchizedek was superior since he blessed him. And so in verse 7, the lesser is blessed by the superior. And that's what he says. And without doubt, the lesser person is blessed by the greater. Now, the third point he makes then is Melchizedek is superior because the Levitical priesthood has dying men collect his tithes. So look at verse 8. He says, in the one case, the tenth is collected by men who die. He's speaking about the Levites, the priests in the order of Aaron, Levitical priests. They collect tithes, and yet they die. In the case of the tenth, the tithe is collected by men who die. But in the other case, that is Melchizedek, who received tithes, by him who is declared to be living. He's the one who lives forever. So he says, with Melchizedek, there's no record of his death, which is what the writer has said earlier. Beginning of days, there's no without beginning or end of life. It's interesting. He says not end of days, but end of life. So what he's saying is he is, as it were, his priesthood. He does die. There's no record of it. So his priesthood is as if it was an eternal one. So with Melchizedek, there's no record of his death. So there's no need for a successor in his priesthood. And so his priesthood, with respect to the biblical record, not the reality of what is, but with respect to the biblical record, he abides a priest forever, at least until the one whom God appoints as the Melchizedekian priest now serves in reality as a priest forever. But he's just making an analogy in argumentation of the superiority. Messiah's priesthood is Melchizedekian. With respect to the biblical record, there's no record of his death, so his priesthood is of an eternal nature. So the Melchizedekian priesthood is eternal, whereas the Levitical priesthood is temporal because those involved in it die. But in the case of Melchizedek, it's as if he did not die. In the case of Messiah, though dead, he's resurrected as a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, as the psalmist, as David had prophesied. So for Melchizedekian's priesthood is superior to Levi in verses 9 and 10. So he says in verse 9, one might even say that Levi, who collected the tenth, paid the tenth through Abraham. So in verse 9, Levi, the founder of the tribe of Levi, from which the Levitical priesthood would descend, the writer is saying, paid tithes to Abraham, paid tithes to Melchizedek, that should say, through Abraham. So what is he talking about? He's saying Levi received tithes and then paid them, as it were, to Melchizedek. How is this so? Verse 10, he explains, because when Melchizedek met Abraham, Levi was still in the body of his ancestor, similarly in Abraham's seed, which eventually would pass down through Isaac and then Jacob to Levi. This is what is meant by imputation. Theologians speak of the imputation of Adam's sin. We're all sinners. This is what original sin is. We have all sinned in Adam. And by sinning in Adam, it's because we're descendants of Adam. And in that Adam sin, The reality is, if we had been in the garden as Adam or as Eve, we would have done the same. And thus, the principle of imputation emphasizes this seminal relationship. We all sinned in Adam. When Adam sinned, all of his posterity had sinned along with him. And thus, therefore, the sin of Adam was imputed to us. And similarly, once we receive Yeshua as our Messiah, the Spirit of God now dwells within us. And through the indwelling presence of the Holy Spirit, the righteousness of God through Messiah is imputed to us. And therefore, we are partakers of the righteousness of God, and thus we now can stand before God. It is Messiah's righteousness imputed to us, and thus becomes our righteousness, as it were. And that's why Paul says he has become our righteousness by means of imputation, as we are in Messiah by means of his Spirit, and his Spirit indwells within us. And through that, and that's why I always say the most important prepositional phrase in the New Testament is Paul's statement, in Messiah. It speaks of imputation, how we are in Messiah, and Messiah is in us by the indwelling presence of the Spirit. And as a consequence, the imputation of Yeshua's righteousness is conveyed to us. This is what the writer to the Hebrews is saying with respect to Levi in Adam was similarly paying tithes to Melchizedek. Therefore, the Levitical priesthood is inferior to Melchizedek. Though not born yet, Levi paid tithes to Melchizedek by means of imputation. Similarly, though we are not fully righteous yet, that will happen when we are in heaven and we receive our bodies that are incorruptible and immortal. When we receive the incorruptible bodies, our spirit will be completely restored in holiness. Right now, we're being conformed to the image of his Son, but one day we will be fully conformed and sinless, standing before, standing with, bowing before, bowing with Messiah, before Messiah in worship and adoration as holy, righteous ones by means of the imputation of Yeshua's righteousness. And though not there yet, the righteousness of God is already imputed to us. Though not yet born, the paying of tithes to Melchizedek by Levi already occurred by means of imputation. So if the fathers, Abraham and Levi, recognized the superiority of Melchizedek, Abraham consciously, Levi imputationally, well, then the rest of the people who pay tithes to Levi should recognize his superiority as well. And if we recognize the superiority of Melchizedek and the Melchizedekian priesthood, we should therefore thereby recognize the superiority of Messiah and the superiority of his priesthood and his kingship, which should result in our doing everything in our power and ability to obey him. And in the case of those to whom the writer is writing, it ought to result in them obeying him and leaving Jerusalem as Messiah commanded them to do. And then the third superiority is the Levitical priesthood and the priesthood of Yeshua. He'll say the Levitical priesthood was changeable, and he'll say the Melchizedekian priesthood was unchangeable. We've got 15 minutes, so let's jump in here in verse 11. The first thing he'll say is Levitical priesthood was changeable. He says that perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, for on the basis of it, the law was given to the people, Why was there still need for another priest to come, one in the order of Melchizedek, not in the order of Aaron? So Levitical priesthood was changeable. So verse 11, when he says, if perfection could have been attained, what he means is, was spiritual maturity. By way of perfection, he doesn't mean sinless perfection. He means spiritual maturity. He's saying there was no spiritual maturity through the Levitical priesthood. If perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, but it was not able to be attained through it. If spiritual maturity was able to be attained through the Levitical priesthood, why was there still a need for another to come after the order of Melchizedek? Because Psalm 110 is the prophecy of the Messiah who would be in the order of Melchizedek, which is what he's building on now. See, in verses 1 through 10, he was focused on the Genesis account, Melchizedek as we read of him with Abraham. Now he's going to focus on the theological implications of reference to Melchizedek in Psalm 110. And in Psalm 110 is the promise that there would be the Messiah who would be divinely appointed to be our king priest after the order of Melchizedek. So the writer is asking, if spiritual maturity could have been attained through the Mosaic law and the Levitical priesthood, why did God have David prophesy of a priest that we would need to come, who would come in the order of Melchizedek? The reason there was a need for David to prophesy of a priest after in the order of Melchizedek is because the Levitical priesthood could not enable one to become spiritually mature. And so we needed another kind of priest. And that priest would have to be a priest after the order of Melchizedek, not after the order of Levi, because the order of Levi was inefficient in bringing about spiritual maturity. That's the point the writer is making. So the promise in Psalm 110, verse 4, of another priest to come in the order of Melchizedek meant the order of Aaron was changeable. The order of Aaron was mutable. It was one that could be changed. It could be ended. But the Melchizedekian order was an eternal order of priesthood that could not be changed because it was needed in order to provide salvation, not only for Israel, but also for the world. Remember, a Melchizedekian priest could be a priest for the nations and not just a priest for Israel. So in verse 12, he says, for when there is a change, there's a changeableness nature, the mutable nature. For when there is a change of the priesthood, there must also be a change of the law. So a change of the priesthood from the Levitical to the Melchizedekian order required a change of the Mosaic law. So here's the point. To have a Melchizedekian priesthood required doing away with the Aharonic order. To do away with the Aharonic order required an end to the Levitical priesthood. But to do away with the Levitical priesthood required doing away with the Mosaic law. So the Mosaic law must come to an end for the Levitical priesthood to end, for the Aharonic order to end, so that the Melchizedekian order can function. Remember, in the Genesis account, the Melchizedekian order is prior to the Levitical order. It's the time of Abraham. The Levitical order is not going to occur until the time of Moses, some 1,000 years later. Abraham is 2,500 years before Messiah, and Moses is about 1,500 years. So Abraham is a good 1,000 years before Moses. So the Melchizedekian order is functioning. Once the law comes into play, the Melchizedekian order is not functioning. It can function, even though it exists, it's eternal, it's not functioning until the Levitical order is brought to an end. But the Levitical order is within the confines of the Mosaic law. So the Levitical order cannot cease until the Mosaic law comes to its conclusion. So for the Aharonic order to end, the Levitical priesthood must end. And for the Levitical priesthood must end, the Mosaic law within which the Levitical priesthood is consigned must come to its conclusion. That's the point the writer to the Hebrews is making. So then in verse 13, he says, he of whom these things are said belonged to a different tribe. That is, he of whom these things are said, speaking about Messiah, he's referring to Psalm 110, you are a priest after the order of Melchizedek. He of whom these things, Psalm 110 verse 4, are said, that is Messiah, belonged to a different tribe. So he's not of the Levitical tribe, he's of the tribe of Judah. And no one from that tribe, that is the tribe of Judah, has ever served at the altar in the priest, in the temple. So the author reminds the readers that Psalm 110 spoke of a priest from David's line, which is odd. According to the law, only a descendant of Levi could function at the altar. But here, Psalm 110 is telling us, that's these things, he, Messiah, of whom these things, Psalm 110 verse 4, are said to belong to a different tribe. That is from the tribe of Judah, not of the tribe of Levi. And he says, no one from that tribe of Judah, has ever served at the altar, that is in the temple. So Messiah had to be of a different order than the Levitical order, because no one can serve in the tabernacle or in the temple altar from the Melchizedekian order. You had to be of the Levitical order. But if we have, but in the case of Messiah, in order to be Melchizedekian, or I should say, in the case of Messiah, he's of the tribe of Judah, but being of the tribe of Judah would not permit him to serve in the altar in the temple. So when the Messianic kingdom comes, the Messiah will build his own temple and will serve in it as our priest king. But that requires the law having come to an end. When did the law come to an end? When Messiah said, this is the blood of the new covenant poured out for the remission of sins. And the establishment of the new covenant begins. Not all of its aspects are fulfilled or brought to fruition, but some are. And but in the Messianic kingdom, the fullness of the new covenant will emerge, and Messiah's king priesthood will be fully fulfilled. Remember, he has not served as a king yet. In his earthly ministry, when he came the first time, he served as a prophet. His prophetic office was seen in his teaching ministry and in his foretelling ministry, foretelling things of the near and far future. His priestly ministry, after the order of Melchizedek, is being seen currently when he ascended to the right hand at the resurrection. At his death, he offers himself as the sacrifice. At his resurrection, he is affirmed as the priest king after the order of Melchizedek, and he's now at the right hand making intercession for us. When he returns, he'll fulfill the office as a king, and at that point, he'll be not merely a king, but a king priest, and he'll build the temple in Jerusalem and serve as king and priest, reigning on his throne, which will be established in the temple. So in verse 14, he says, for it is clear that our Lord descended from Judah. And in regard to that tribe, Levi, Moses said nothing. In regard to that tribe, Judah, Moses said nothing about being a priest. So Messiah had to be of a different order than the Levitical order. He descended from Judah. But a priest, he descended from Judah as a king, but as a priest, he was after the order of Melchizedek. And so in verses 15 through 19, the writer specifies that the Levitical priesthood was temporary. Now, we're going to stop at verse 19, but in verse 20, he's going to speak about how the Melchizedekian order is unchangeable. And then he'll also speak about how the Melchizedekian priesthood was eternal and not temporary. So in verse 15, he says, and what we have said is even more clear. If another priest like Melchizedek appears, now it's important to recognize another doesn't mean another like Melchizedek. It's actually the word heteros. Heteros means another of a different kind. So what he's saying is, and what we have said is even more clear if a different kind of priest like Melchizedek appears, a different kind of priest. So he's saying not another Levitical priest, but another priest of a different kind, a priest of a different order. That is a priest, a Melchizedekian priest, rather than a priest like Levi or Aaron. He says it's even more clear. In other words, based on what I've already said, it becomes even more clear when we realize that Yeshua is of the tribe of Judah, which fits perfectly into the scenario we need in order for him to be a Melchizedekian priest. So the author now draws a contrast between the old and the new in verse 16. One who has become a priest, not on the basis of the regulation as to his ancestry, that's what a Levitical priest had to have, but on the basis of the power of an indestructible life. See, that's the resurrection. So he says the author draws a contrast between the old priesthood and the new priesthood, or the Melchizedekian priesthood. The old priesthood was based on the law. It was outward in nature. It was outward in that it necessitated ancestral heritage, something we see externally by virtue of its records. We're a descendant of this tribe. But the new, or the Melchizedekian priesthood, based on the new covenant, it's based on power. That is power that is inward in nature, power from on high. In other words, divine appointment. God exercising his power in determining who the Melchizedekian priest would be. In the old system, a person was a priest because his father was of priestly descent. That's the outward nature. We can see who is who is one's father. We can see who that is. But in the new, one had to be made, and that's why he says, one who has become a priest, not on the basis of regulation as to ancestry, but on the power. One who has, my translation, has become, but has been made a priest, he says, and the the phrase is in the perfect tense, which means he has been made a priest and remains a priest. That's what the perfect tense means. So his priesthood is not one that ends, but one that is eternal. He says, Mai says, on the basis of a regulation as to his ancestry, based on the basis of a regulation. The phrase here means a rule, or another translation is a rule of a human commandment, entales sarkines. Some translated a rule of a human commandment. Mine says the basis of a regulation as to his ancestry, a rule of a human commandment. But this word sarkines comes from the word sark, which is a word means flesh or carnal. So the point is, the law dealing with the Levitical system was fleshly because it was based upon human birthright and human descendancy. So it was carnal, not carnal in the sense of immoral, but carnal in the sense of fleshless, like incarnation. That's a very crass word when we speak of Messiah's incarnation. It means he became infleshed. He became, it's sort of a crass word to speak of how, to emphasize the great gulf that God bridged between divine glory and majesty and human nature. He went from divine majesty to enfleshment. It's not to say enfleshment is sinful or evil. It's only to express the great distance, the great divergence between spiritual majesty, divine majesty, and human enfleshment. There's just such a wide gulf. I remember C.S. Lewis once trying to speak to convey what was the in order to sort of state the distance that was bridged when Messiah took on human form. He said it would be like a man, a human being, becoming a slug in order to reach slugs. That's how he put it. The distance is so dramatic, and here, and even that doesn't capture the great distance between God and in all of his glory and humanity. So the word incarnation speaks of the crassness of enfleshment. Messiah took on enfleshment, having given up his divine prerogatives. Similarly, that's what he speaks of the commandment that priests had to descend from Levi as being carnal or fleshly because it's based on human birthright, human ancestry, human descendancy. But Messiah's priesthood was not based on that. Now, his kingship was based on ancestry, but his priesthood was not. It was based on the power of an indestructible life, the writer says, on the basis of the power of an indestructible life. Yeshua became a priest after his resurrection, and by virtue of his resurrection, he lives forever. So it is a manifestation of the power of God unleashed within him so as to bring about his resurrection from the dead, not merely his body being brought back to life, but his body being brought back to life indestructible. And thus he's the first fruits of those who sleep. He's the first human being, as the God man, human being that is resurrected so as never to die again, so that his flesh put on immortality, his flesh put on incorruptibility or incorruption. And thus the power of God was unleashed not only around him, but within him, thus igniting him as a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And that's why the writer then quotes Psalm 110, verse 4, in which he says, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. The eternality of Yeshua's priesthood, you are a priest forever, and the character of Yeshua's priesthood after the order of Melchizedek, which character we've spoken of throughout this chapter. So in verse 18, he states, the former regulation is set aside, the law, because it was weak and useless, for the law made nothing perfect, and a better hope is introduced by which we draw near to God. So this is the conclusion he will now draw from what he has stated. Let's stop there. We're already after 8. We'll pick it up here at verse 18, but we've said much about the majesty of our Messiah with respect to the superiority of the Melchizedekian priesthood to that of the Aaronic priesthood. And I think we've got a greater sense of what that really means. So let me stop our sharing. I'll then stop the recording